It was a rainy afternoon in the winter of 1965 when Bumpy Johnson sat across the table from a man who had, until recently, been nothing more than a shadow, someone operating on the outskirts of Harlem's power dynamics. The CIA operative, a well-dressed man with a stiff, methodical air, had come to make an offer, one that would shape Bumpy's future and change the course of Harlem's criminal underworld forever. The man, whose name Bumpy still didn't quite trust, slid a folder across the table. The air in the room felt thick, charged, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Bumpy didn't even bother to glance at the contents of the folder, his gaze fixed on the man sitting opposite him. "Mr. Johnson," the agent began, his voice low and controlled. "We need a man who knows the streets, a man who commands respect in places we can't reach. We need you to help us, to do something that benefits both our interests, and in return, you'll receive resources, connections, that will expand your operations beyond anything you've ever dreamed." Bumpy leaned back, his expression unreadable. The tension between them was palpable, but beneath the calm exterior, his mind raced. The CIA. They were asking him to enter a world he had never imagined. A world of espionage, government operations, and international stakes. Yet the promise of control, of power that reached beyond Harlem's borders, was tantalizing. "You're asking me to help you with something that's going to get me killed, aren't you?" Bumpy's words were cutting, the accusation clear in his tone. His grip tightened on his drink, his knuckles whitening. The agent didn't flinch. "You're a man who's survived everything. Do you think we don't know that? We need you to help us with something that will be mutually beneficial. If you want to keep what you've built, your territory, your influence, this is the only way." Bumpy knew that power in Harlem wasn't something you could just take. You had to earn it and hold on to it. And now, as the CIA made its move, it was clear that his ability to keep his empire in place depended on a decision that could change everything. But there was something about this offer that nagged at him. It felt like a gamble, one he wasn't sure he wanted to take. But then, in the world of crime, wasn't everything a gamble? "Let's get something straight," Bumpy said, his voice steady but laced with authority. "I don't do favors, not without knowing what's in it for me. I've fought too damn hard to let someone else come in and tell me what to do." The CIA operative, recognizing the magnitude of Bumpy's stance, nodded slowly. "You won't be told what to do, Mr. Johnson, but you'll have an opportunity to expand your reach, influence more than just the streets of Harlem." Bumpy's gaze never wavered. "And what's the catch?" The agent leaned in, lowering his voice. "You help us, and we'll make sure no one gets in your way. Not the police, not the Mafia, not even the politicians. Your territory will be yours for as long as you want it." The weight of the words hung in the air. Bumpy Johnson, who had always operated on his own terms, now faced an offer that could change the trajectory of his power forever. But there was a price. He could feel it in the air, thick as the smoke from his cigar. And this price was one that would test everything he believed in. By 1965, Bumpy Johnson had already cemented his name as one of Harlem's most feared and respected figures. He had come from nothing, rising through the ranks of the criminal world with a mix of sheer will, cunning, and the ability to earn the loyalty of those around him. Harlem wasn't just a city to him, it was his kingdom, built through years of street smarts, business acumen, and the occasional bloody battle to protect what was his. Born in Charleston, South Carolina, in 1905, Bumpy's early life was shaped by hardship. The son of a laundress, he grew up understanding the value of survival in a world stacked against him. His upbringing wasn't one of luxury or privilege, but rather of grinding it out in the harshest environments, learning the lessons of power and survival. By the time he came to Harlem in the late 1920s, he wasn't just a man with ambition. He was a force of nature, a street hustler with a plan to take over. In Harlem, Bumpy quickly made a name for himself. He had an uncanny ability to navigate the complex web of power and crime that ran through the streets. He took control of the numbers racket, but he wasn't content with just controlling one part of Harlem's underworld. He He expanded his influence into various illegal ventures, from bootlegging to gambling, and made sure that no one crossed him without facing dire consequences. By the 1930s, Bumpy was no longer just a criminal. He was a king in Harlem streets, a figure of both fear and respect. His influence stretched beyond the criminal circles. He had connections with politicians, police officers, and even business owners. But Bumpy was no fool. He understood that in the world of crime, alliances were fragile and that no one, not even him, was untouchable. Power was never guaranteed, no matter how much respect one commanded. Harlem, as vibrant and thriving as it was also a battleground, a place where the lines between business, politics, and crime were often blurred. Bumpy knew that in order to maintain his dominance, he needed more than just muscle. He needed leverage, and sometimes that leverage came from the most unlikely places. That's where the CIA's offer came in. The streets of Harlem had changed. The rise of the civil rights movement was gaining momentum, and with it, the tensions between the black community and the powers that be. Government, law enforcement, and political elites were on the rise. The dynamics of power were shifting, and Bumpy, ever the strategist, knew that to stay ahead, he had to adapt. That was when the CIA came calling. At first, Bumpy had no reason to trust them. They weren't from his world. But the promise of expanded influence, of control that reached beyond Harlem's borders, was too tempting to ignore. It was a deal with the devil, to be sure. But for Bumpy, the devil always had the best deals. It was in the blood. The CIA's offer wasn't just about the money or the influence. It was about the kind of power that Bumpy had never experienced. A power that extended beyond the streets of Harlem, beyond the criminal world he had mastered. This was a game played at the highest levels of government, with stakes that reached into politics, international relations, and espionage. And Bumpy wasn't naive. He understood that getting involved with the CIA meant entering a world where rules didn't apply, where everything was a trade-off. The tension began to rise as Bumpy took the offer under consideration. He couldn't afford to rush into this deal without understanding the consequences. But the more he thought about it, the more it seemed like a golden opportunity. The CIA had resources that Bumpy couldn't access through his normal channels. They had intelligence, influence, and connections to people who could open doors Bumpy never knew existed. But there were risks. The more involved he became, the more vulnerable he would be to manipulation and control. The CIA had their own agenda, and they were not the type to be trusted blindly. Bumpy knew that this deal, if it went wrong, could lead to a deadly game where he wouldn't be the one pulling the strings. And in the world he operated in, being controlled by someone else meant certain death. Bumpy spent the next few days carefully weighing the decision. He met with his most trusted allies, men who had stood by him through thick and thin, and discussed the implications of the deal. Each man gave his opinion, but Bumpy was the one who had to make the final call. He was the king, the one who had built this empire, and he would be the one to either solidify it or watch it crumble. As the days passed, Bumpy's thoughts grew darker. He knew he had to take the deal, but it came with a price. The CIA didn't just want his help. They wanted him to commit to their agenda. They wanted him to work as their asset, to use his street knowledge and influence to carry out operations that would benefit their larger goals. Bumpy knew that crossing this line meant changing the course of his life forever, but he also knew one thing: he couldn't afford to lose control of his empire. The day Bumpy made his decision, he knew there was no turning back. He had agreed to the CIA's offer, but the terms of the deal weren't as simple as they seemed. They weren't just asking for his help, they were asking for his allegiance. In return, they promised him resources, protection, and a foothold in the world of power that extended far beyond the streets of Harlem. The first task came quickly, a mission that involved disrupting a rival gang's operations. The CIA wanted control of Harlem's narcotics trade, and Bumpy's job was to ensure that their competitors couldn't get a foothold in his territory. For Bumpy, it wasn't just another street job. This was a test of loyalty, of power, and of how far he was willing to go for his own survival. Bumpy's world was a delicate balance, a tightrope walk between those he could trust and those he needed to use. But in the world of espionage, trust was a commodity you couldn't afford, and Bumpy knew this. He had learned long ago that every ally came with an agenda. This wasn't just about protecting his turf anymore. This was about navigating a world where alliances shifted like sand, and betrayal was a matter of course. The meeting with the CIA agent was set in a nondescript hotel room in Manhattan. Bumpy knew that this would be a pivotal moment, one where the stakes were no longer just about money, drugs, or power in Harlem. This was about survival on a global scale. The agent, once a shadow in the background, now stood before him with a folder in hand. "This is the target," he said, opening the file to reveal the name of Bumpy's next enemy, one of the top rivals in the narcotics game, a man whose operation had started to encroach on CIA interests. "You'll take him out," the agent continued, his voice sharp. "We need him gone, and we need it done discreetly." Bumpy studied the man, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. The man sitting across from him wasn't just any government agent. He represented a shadow world where actions spoke louder than words. A world where the lines between right and wrong blurred, and every deal came at a price. "You don't need to tell me how to do my job," Bumpy said with quiet confidence. He'd been taking out rivals for years, but this felt different. The stakes were higher, and the repercussions further reaching than anything he'd ever dealt with before. The agent gave a brief nod, but there was a tension in his eyes. "We'll be watching, Bumpy. Don't disappoint us." Bumpy could feel the weight of those words, but he didn't let it show. He knew what this meant. He was already deep into the game. There was no turning back now. The deal was done, and the power he had been promised was within his grasp. But even as he nodded and accepted the mission, a small part of him couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the cost of this deal would be greater than he anticipated. There were bigger players at hand now, men and women who operated in shadows, and they didn't play by the rules of the streets. The hit went off without a hitch. The rival gang leader was taken out quietly, a clean shot in the middle of the night. The CIA was pleased with the results, and Bumpy's crew quickly moved to fill the power vacuum. Harlem seemed untouched by the chaos, as Bumpy's empire tightened its grip, further solidifying his place at the top. The people of Harlem, ever loyal to their king, recognized the efficiency with which he operated. But there was a cost. The consequences of his actions began to unfold slowly. The balance Bumpy had worked so hard to maintain was shifting. The CIA's hold over him was growing, and with each passing day, Bumpy realized that the power he had gained came with more strings attached than he had anticipated. For a man who had always played by his own rules, being beholden to the CIA wasn't an easy pill to swallow. He was a criminal, but he wasn't a pawn. He had always prided himself on his ability to move in the world without being controlled, without answering to anyone but himself. But now, as he took on missions for the CIA and expanded his operations into new territories, he could feel the walls closing in. His loyalty was being bought, but at what cost? The people around him, his closest allies, began to notice the change. They saw that Bumpy was becoming less of the man who ruled Harlem with an iron fist, and more of a man caught in a web he couldn't escape. It wasn't just the gangsters who began to look at him differently. Harlem's business elite, the ones who had always relied on Bumpy's protection, began to question his newfound dealings with the CIA. They wondered if Bumpy had gone too far, if his connections to the government would bring unwanted attention to their operations. Bumpy's community was still loyal, but they could feel the tension building. Harlem had always thrived on its own rules, its own understanding of power and respect. The CIA, with its cold, calculating methods, was a different world altogether. It wasn't the world Bumpy had been born into, the one that had made him the man he was. And it was clear that this world was beginning to change him. But for Bumpy, there was no going back. The deal had been made, and he had no choice but to continue playing the game. The Mafia, the rival gangs, and now the CIA were all pieces on the board. The question was, who would come out on top? As the months passed, Bumpy Johnson's name continued to grow in stature, not just in Harlem, but across New York City. His operations had expanded, his influence had reached beyond the streets, And the CIA had made sure that Bumpy's position was unchallenged, but at what cost? In Harlem, Bumpy was still a legend, still a king. He had earned the respect of the streets, and that was something that couldn't be taken from him. But now, his legend was intertwined with the very government he had once avoided. The CIA had given him power, but they had also given him a chain, one that he couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried. He had built his empire on loyalty, respect, and the understanding that power came with consequences. But this new chapter in his life wasn't as simple as the street wars he had fought before. This was the kind of power that transcended Harlem. It was the kind of power that reached into the halls of government, the kind of power that could make or break entire nations. But no matter how far he climbed, no matter how deep he got into the game, Bumpy Johnson remained who he had always been, a man who understood the value of respect and the cost of betrayal. The CIA had helped him grow his empire, but they had also exposed him to a world that operated by its own rules, rules that Bumpy didn't always understand. But he had come this far, and he wasn't about to stop now. Bumpy had survived everything that life had thrown his way, and he would survive this too. His empire, his legacy, it was built on his strength, his resolve, and his unflinching willingness to do whatever it took to protect what was his. In the streets of Harlem, Bumpy Johnson was still the king. But the world outside those streets, there the rules had changed, and Bumpy would have to navigate them carefully if he wanted to remain on top. Bumpy Johnson's decision to make a deal with the CIA marked a turning point in his life and legacy. Harlem, the streets that had once been his sole domain, were now just one part of a much larger world, a world where the stakes were higher and the risks greater. He had achieved power beyond his wildest dreams, but in doing so, he had become part of a system that operated on terms he didn't entirely control. Bumpy's legacy was never going to be defined by one deal, one action, or one betrayal. It was defined by his ability to command loyalty, his unbreakable will, and his relentless drive to hold on to what he had built. He was a king of Harlem, and no amount of political maneuvering, no alliance with the CIA could change that. But in the end, the lesson was clear. Power, no matter how much you have, always comes with a price. And sometimes that price is more than you bargained for. Bumpy Johnson knew that better than anyone.